Did you know that nearly 60% of people with mental health issues never seek help? What's stopping them? How would you feel if you couldn't talk about your mental health struggles without fear of judgment? What if the biggest barrier to mental illness recovery isn't the condition itself, but the stigma surrounding it? But also, could mental health stigma be more than just a personal issue and a real societal crisis? Join me after the intro for a conversation with a very special friend with whom we will answer this and many more questions. So grab a cup of coffee, settle in, and let's start. Hi, I'm Rossana D, and this is Forgive and Thrive, a podcast where we explore what thriving in life means and how we can achieve it, irrespective of our past, current condition, and expectations that those around us or society in general may have. Let's go. Welcome to the Forgive and Thrive show. If you have been following our show, you probably know why I decided to start it. For everyone else, here is a short recap. 5 years ago, I hit a wall. I burned out. And I remember a conversation with my mother shortly after being sent home by the occupational doctor. She advised me not to mention anything about it when a couple of months later, I was going to visit for my vacation. I know she was coming from a place of love and that we didn't know enough about what was happening to me to share and answer questions. But it made me think. And I decided there and then that as soon as I was and felt better, I would have done everything I could to raise awareness about it. So today we want to talk about something that's really close to my heart, mental health stigma. We dive deep into why ending mental health stigma matters more than ever. We will explore the real, often hidden, impacts it has on individuals and society. I hope that by sharing real stories and insights, we can all take a step towards creating a more understanding and supporting world for those struggling with mental health issues. And I couldn't find a better person to talk about this extremely important topic than today's guest, Laverne Friesen. Laverne is on a mission to raise awareness about the damaging effects of mental health stigma. After surviving a prolonged mental health crisis and the deaths of despair, he was pulled back from the brink of suicide by the love and presence of his children. In an incredible journey of post-traumatic growth and with an unwavering commitment to personal development, he has completely transformed his life. Today, Laverne is eager to share the life-changing lessons that he learned. His enthusiasm for personal growth and mental health radiates every time he speaks, inspiring and empowering others to embrace their own journeys of healing and transformation. Hi, Laverne. Welcome to the Forgive and Try show. Thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you for having me today.
Yes, it's a very important topic, and I'm really eager to start. As I said, I started the Forgive and Try podcast to raise awareness about mental health issues and the stigma that still in 2024 surrounds many people who are suffering or have suffered of conditions related to mental health. So I would like to know what your experience is about it and everything that you do to raise awareness. But before we go into that, can we start with your personal journey and in particular your experience with stigma?
Yeah, absolutely. And I just wanted to share really quickly that when I realized that I had almost died from suicide, from mental health stigma, and that stigma is completely ridiculous, I became very passionate about breaking down the barriers because if you're going to die, you should have a good reason to die, right? Like it should be, whatever it might be, like old age. It shouldn't be because of something that's so petty, I guess, a stigma. My story starts when I was a child, except I didn't realize that's when it started. I grew up in a cult-like community, and I had a very abusive parent, and I experienced sexual abuse as well. That kind of laid the foundation for my mental health later in life, and it came back to kind of haunt me. But the story, as I want to start with, I was working in law enforcement about in 2017, so 7 years ago. And I thought I was living the dream. I was married, I had a good job, we had a young family at home, we had a new house in a good neighborhood, and I was in the best physical shape of my life. And so I thought I had it made. But in March of 2017, I was involved in a traffic stop with someone who I would say is probably the most irrational individual that I've ever dealt with. And to make the problem worse, he posted a picture of me on social media, and then he filled the comments with veiled threats towards me. But the worst part about that is I had seen his driver's license and I knew, and he lived just right around the corner from me. And so I started worrying quite a bit about it. I'm very active as a father, and I was often out and still am, in the neighborhood with my children. And a week later, I experienced my first ever anxiety attack when I saw this man again, and he never saw me. And I was in uniform and on duty in a marked patrol vehicle, and I had this anxiety attack. But I did what I always did, and I just let time take care of the issue because I didn't have an understanding, and it kind of went away. And within about a month of this incident, I was put in a role where I began having the most fun that I'd ever had at work. But about a month into that, I got pulled from that and assigned to a task that I thought was impossible. And I didn't feel qualified to do it, but my management team told me that I was the only person that could get a successful outcome. And so, of course, I had this tremendous amount of pressure on myself. And so I was kind of operating from this point of where I had received an injury that I hadn't dealt with, but I had no idea. And then I was now putting pressure on myself. In addition to that, my childhood had instilled this very deep sense of unworthiness in me, which I also wasn't aware that I was operating with. So I got my validation from the praise of others. And I always felt that I had to give of myself. So not only was I stressed out at work, I was coming home to a young family and giving all of myself there, trying to be the best dad that I could and the best husband that I could be. Of course, I'm burning out, but I don't realize it. So then over the summer months, I was continuously getting stressed out and I began to get irritable. And every time I went to my managers to try to get some support on this project, they all seemed to be on holidays. And so I wasn't getting any support. What I didn't realize was my childhood abandonment wound was now starting to surface. So I'm very irritable. My inner child is starting to freak out because this looks familiar. And over the summer months, my irritability turned into anger. And so I became angry a lot, quite a bit. And I'm normally this pretty relaxed, chill person. By fall, there was times where I would fly into a rage. In November, I went to see a counselor for the first time ever. And as a man, just the stigma of going to see a counselor was I had to overcome that. Probably took me a month and a half of thinking about it before I went. But additionally, I carried a lot of stigma about how I'd be perceived in the workplace as well, because I was known as a leader and I didn't want to be perceived as broken or weak. And so I had to overcome a lot of that just to go see the counselor. So I walked into her office and within 15 minutes, she told me I needed to take a leave from work. And I was like, ugh. But I knew that she was telling the truth. So I decided to take a leave. It was so bad at that point that I really didn't care how I'd be perceived. I went to my doctor and I said, I need to go off work. And I didn't know anything about it. I'd never done it before. And he said, how long do you need? And I said, I don't know. How long should I have? And he's like, well, I need a date. And in hindsight, he should have told me. He should have asked me more questions and he should have told me. So I took 3 weeks. So I came back to work. The first thing I did, or one of the first things I did, was get in a heated argument with the supervisor, and I was accused of insubordination. And that in itself should have been a huge red flag to anyone that knew me and myself. Like I should have been like, whoa, what's going on, right? But I just went back to work. I tried to go with the flow. Nothing seemed to help. It wasn't quite as bad as it was when I went on stress leave, but it hadn't got any better either. I knew it, but I didn't understand mental health. And I continued to see my counselor once a month. And I don't think she understood the law enforcement profession, but I was self-stigmatizing and lying to myself, so I wasn't being honest with her either. And so there was no way she could help me. A few months later, and my management team informed me that they weren't going to promote into the position or fill the position, but that I was the de facto leader anyway. So now, once again, I'm putting a ton of pressure on myself. And here in Alberta, law enforcement follows a program. It's called the Selective Traffic Enforcement Program. And the government kind of dictates what law enforcement agencies should focus their enforcement efforts on for the month for traffic safety. And for February here, it's distracted driving. And by this time, I'd been a first responder for about 10 years, and I had seen a lot of the consequences of distracted driving. Well, about halfway through the month, I began to feel off, and I couldn't really explain it, but something felt off. And it seemed like everyone I dealt with was really abrasive, angry, and yelling at me. And so I began to focus on just trying to make it to March. I just wanted that month to be over. I wanted to show my managers that I could lead my shift through this enforcement blitz. But then I was done. And when March 1st came, I had no energy left. I was exhausted. I was apathetic. And my work days started just consisting of me driving around, drinking coffee, and not doing anything, which should have been a red flag, but nobody seemed to care or pick up on it. Eventually, it got to the point where I couldn't sleep at night before my shifts. And so I started taking sleep aids, and for a couple months, I was taking 5 times the recommended dose of the sleep aid, and I wasn't sleeping. I would sleep for an hour and a half to 2 hours. And what I was doing, though, is I was laying in bed trying to fall asleep, but it wouldn't happen. And then I would start ruminating on how bad my life was becoming. And it was just this vicious circle in my head that just got worse and worse and worse. And eventually, I began having suicidal thoughts. And I would think, well, this is the only way out. Like, my life is so bad now. The only thing I can do is to end my life. That's the only way I can get out. The one thing that saved me was every night, my then 3-year-old daughter would wake up during the night and come to my bed, and she would cuddle in right beside me, and she would put her head like right in my armpit, and she would just snuggle in beside me and fall asleep. And every night while I was laying in bed planning my own demise, it was to the point where I was walking myself through it. She would come to my bed, come beside me, and I would feel her warmth of her body, and I would listen to her breathing, and I knew that I had to fight on, but I didn't know how to do it. In my career, I had worked with some really amazing individuals who were involved in peer support. And they had always said, if you ever need help, just reach out. And the closest I ever came was starting to type out a text message at 3 a.m. And then Stigma overpowered me, and I deleted it, and I never sent it. In hindsight, it's because even though I knew they cared, in the fog of depression and anxiety and suicidal thoughts and stigma, I did not know for 100% sure that they were a safe place for me, because I'd never heard their story. And that's why I tell my story with all the detail that I do, because I want people to know that it's okay and that I'm a safe place. So eventually, I was desperate to stay alive, but I didn't know how. I was too scared to reach out. So there was one person in my life that I thought for sure would help me. And I went to them and I told them how bad it was. But for some reason, my message wasn't received, and I blamed myself. But I was desperate, and so a few nights later, I went back again and again tried to express how bad it was. And they looked at me, they looked me in the eye, and they said, I know. And then they walked out of the room. I hope nobody ever has to experience that level of despair and loneliness. I continued to fight on. I didn't know how I was going to do it. I just knew that I somehow had to stay alive. I wasn't even necessarily existing. I was just trying to stay alive. During this time, there was many outbursts in the office. One day I yelled at 3 managers in front of about 10 people, which was not who I was. That is not who I am. Nobody reached out to ask if I was okay. Nobody reached out to ask what was going on. And somehow during this time frame, I had been approved for an instructor's course. And so my department sent me down to Colorado in the United States for a week-long course. But about halfway through that course, I started dreading coming back home. A few days after I got home, I bumped into a firefighter that I knew. We had never worked together, We just had been around and seen each other a few times. I ended up having a 2 or 3 hour conversation with him. And we didn't talk anything about mental health. And I don't know if he knew that I was struggling or suspected anything, but just having that conversation and that connection with another person gave me hope, inspired me to keep going. Because I was self-stigmatizing and lying to myself, I was lying to my counselor that I was still seeing during this whole time. The whole time I was suicidal, not sleeping. She didn't have a clue about it because I was too scared to talk about it. Which is also another thing, is when you go looking for a therapist, you need to find one that you can trust and build a relationship with, because I should have been sharing that with her. But I was scared that if I did, she'd call my colleagues and I'd be carted off to the hospital. I didn't realize there's a spectrum to suicidality, and all I needed is somebody to hold space for me and talk to me. But she told me, she's like, you just need a new job. That's what you need. You need a new job. You'll be better. I had been having outbursts in the office. It was a toxic work environment. It wasn't a great place to be to begin with. Myself and a few other people had seen some issues we were concerned about. And so we filed a complaint, which was eventually confirmed, but there was some really toxic behavior in the workplace. And I ended up having to get the union involved to protect me. And when I was asked, I got sent to this big meeting with human resources, my management, and the union. And when I got asked what was wrong, I just started crying in front of a room full of people. I had to leave the room, cry it out, come back. When I came back, I was angry and hostile. Still, nobody ever offered me support. I was lucky enough that a neighboring agency was hiring and I got a position. I still don't know how. I thought for sure that they would see through my facade. They would see that something was going on. But I think that shows how good we can hide it too. So when I eventually got a new position and I handed in my resignation, my manager approached me and said, well, we've just kind of left you alone. I've wondered, would you have been willing to stand up at my funeral and say that? So anyway, I started my new job. I thought everything would be better. I was under less stress, so I felt a little bit better, but something was off. And I just thought, oh, it's going to be time. I just need some more time, to get over this. Time never changed it. In the fall, I went on a camping trip in the Rocky Mountains. I went with a friend of mine and I thought, 8 days out here, this is going to reset me. Well, it didn't. So I came back to work. I'm still struggling. I don't know what's going on. Like, I'm kind of happy, but I just feel off. And then on October 30th, 2018, I was the first on scene to a motor vehicle collision. And as I got out of my vehicle, I was approached by a couple with some young children who were crying. And the children were fine physically, they were just upset. And as soon as I saw them, I got a lump in my throat. I couldn't talk. My mind started racing. My heart started racing. I just couldn't really function. And so I said something to them. They seemed happy. I have no idea what I told them. And I went to check on the other vehicles in the collision. And there were 3 vehicles involved. And I didn't notice the 3rd vehicle until I walked up to it. And so I must have been experiencing some form of tunnel vision as well. I wanted to help people in the collision. There was a couple injured people. I couldn't help them. I couldn't talk to them because I start crying right away. I found a girl in the back seat of a vehicle. She was crying. She was fine otherwise. And I wanted to comfort her. She reminded me of my daughter, and I couldn't talk. And so I kind of stood back and I watched as the fire department showed up, and there was a firefighter there that I knew. He had such poise and professionalism, and he was so good at his job. I just pined on a time when that had been me. I was supposed to be this professional and who was poised and really good at my job. And I felt that I was broken, and it really scared me. So after my shift, I started looking for a therapist, one that I would trust, that understood trauma and first responders. And I found a psychologist. And on the day of my first appointment, I cried the whole time. I knew I was going to get help. And during that session, she leaned over and she said, "You are not alone," which was very comforting to hear, but I didn't really believe it for a few months. But I embraced therapy. I embraced learning about myself, learning how to change my mindset and reframe negatives and positives. And that's my whole childhood trauma. Of course, I'm thinking negatively because nothing good ever happened. And so my catastrophic style of thinking would protect me. I was always right when something bad happened. And I wasn't disappointed when something good didn't happen. So that was quite eye-opening for me. Probably the single most life-changing event, though, was we did EMDR therapy. And EMDR stands for eye movement desensitization and reprocessing. She asked me what was bothering me, and I told her. And then she asked me to feel the feeling in my body. When was the first time I felt it? And I was taken back 30 years, and I could feel it. And to the most traumatic instant of my life in my childhood. And at the end of the session, she asked me, or to tell her something good that came out of that. And the answer was instantaneous. And I told her that I was a better dad because of it. And that was what was important, is to be a good dad to my children. And to be able to take this very horrific event of my childhood and be grateful for it is incredibly life-changing. It doesn't minimize the trauma that it caused, the pain and the hurt, but to be able to reframe it, that's how you can heal. That's how you can grow. I finally believed that I wasn't alone. About 6 months after I'd started therapy, I ran into a retired police officer. We were acquaintances, and as soon as he saw me, he left the conversation that he was in, and he approached me, and he said, "Hey, Laverne, let's talk." And the first thing he asked me was, "Hey, what's going on?" Well, of course, I knew what he meant, but I was still fighting stigma, so I didn't tell him. But he carried on. He said, "Listen, I have PTSD. I understand this." And then he told me his story and how he got through it, knowing that someone else had been through it themselves. It had seen symptoms or signs in me and wanted to come tell me, to show me that I wasn't alone, was amazing. I call it the golden hug from the universe. And that's when I truly felt inspired and had hope, because I knew that I wasn't alone then. And I want to talk about the firefighter at that collision that I was watching, the guy I knew that was so poised and professional. Several months after that incident, he died from suicide. And we don't know who's suffering or how they'll show it or how fast it'll come on. There I was, standing broken on the side of the road. I felt I was broken. But yet, the person I was looking up to, maybe they were the really broken one. And I'm so grateful, because in my career, I've worked with 5 individuals who died from suicide. And they were all rising stars and high performers until they weren't. I'm so grateful, though, because I had help with my demons. I had a 3-year-old angel, and they didn't. And I'm so grateful for that. And it's part of the reason that I feel very strongly that I wasn't meant to die. I wasn't supposed to die. I was supposed to learn and then go show others. I was supposed to help others. And when I look back at that time, and when I started to realize that the stigma that surrounds mental health is just so ridiculous. We all suffer somehow, some way, eventually, at some level, and we need to talk about it. If people were dying for so stupid of reasons, like stigma, because they're too scared to talk, society would do something about it. You look at, say, the Tide Pod Challenge, where kids are doing this Tide Pod Challenge and they're dying. It's so stupid. And think about how all the warnings that went out, be aware of this. We're not doing that about stigma of mental health. And it's just as stupid. It is, because so many people suffer and so many people just try to fight through it alone and don't know how to deal with it. And in the workplace, it's so prevalent. Look at how many people swap jobs their whole life. They bounce from jobs or whatever. Because most of the time, or a huge majority of the time, it's not performance related. It's mental health of some sort. Whether it's because you have a bad boss or some toxic coworkers, or you're going through a divorce, or you're experiencing grief, that affects your performance. And when we can get society to realize that we're doing this to each other, we're killing each other. And if we can just be more trauma informed and just be more mindful of our interactions with each other and the people anybody, I think we can kind of reverse this, and we can start improving life for everyone. And I don't understand why organizations don't get behind this. Well, I have a good idea, but it only improves productivity if you have happy people, if your people are healthy, if they enjoy being at work, doing what they do, if they feel supported. There's so much more we can do for people, for each other. Nobody needs to go through this.
Wow, Laverne, I have to say, I didn't have the courage to stop your story anywhere because it's such a compelling story. And thank you for sharing it in so many details. I think it's important. And I can resonate with basically everything, from the childhood trauma that I went through. I was molested as a child into a toxic environment. And I agree with you. One of the issues that we have nowadays is that people don't want to talk about it. And this keeps the stigma going. And if we don't talk, unfortunately, on one end, we don't learn about recognizing the signs and recognizing that someone may look all right, but perhaps deep down they are not all right. We go into work thinking that perhaps we know the people we work and we know everything about them, while in fact what we know is a dot in their own life. And we don't have to know. It would be enough just to show some compassion and to be open to a real conversation rather than fighting for everything. I absolutely agree and love everything that you have just shared with us. There are a few things actually that you mentioned that caught my attention. One is that for you being a man, it was very difficult to open up. And I think it's an issue because mental health doesn't have gender. A lot of the people I talk with are women, and perhaps women find it a little bit easier to open up. There is this idea of a man as the provider, as the one that has to appear strong all the time. And I think it's important to recognize that with mental health issues, it's not that you are less strong. In fact, when you get to a point where the word suicide starts to enter your life, and I've been there as well, you have to show up for yourself more than every other day in your life. It takes a lot of courage to stay strong. It takes a lot of courage in that moment to actually not complete it. And there is something that you mentioned, and it's the word hope, that a lot of people don't perhaps understand how much hope or lack of it can really make a difference for a person to start thinking about suicide or staying on a track where they can sort of navigate everything that is happening to them. So honestly, thank you for everything that you have mentioned so far. There is one aspect about the difficulty that often men have to open up about these things and access resources and mental health care.
Yeah, I think it's a lot harder for men. And I think that the most obvious reason for that is women often share with other women, with their friend, and men don't often do that as much. And especially where I live in northern Canada, there's a lot of oil field activity, which is a very macho kind of industry. There's logging, which is the same. There's farming, which is the same. But the suicide rates and the drug overdose rates are extremely high. There's a lot of isolation, and we isolate ourselves because we don't have those connections that we can trust. And there's not a lot of men that are willing to be open about their struggles, especially leaders. We need people in leadership positions to be open about how they've struggled. The resources are there, but they're not accessing them. One thing I've got involved in my city is I'm involved in 2 different men's peer support groups. They're so beneficial to anyone that attends, but it's getting the word out there that these exist. But even then, we all think our suffering is special, but it's not, because it's so similar. I can go to a men's group and sit with other men, within 5 years of my age, and we have such similar experiences. And yet none of us come from the same career backgrounds, a host of a huge variety of different upbringings. There's one man in the group, he worked in the oil field and got addicted to drugs and alcohol. And meanwhile, I went into law enforcement, tried to help people. And we did what we did for the exact same reasons. We're both trying to seek some sort of validation. We've talked about this a few times. We didn't know each other. We only met each other in the last 6 months, but we grew up our paths take these completely different turns, but now in our 40s, they kind of come back and we kind of get to the same place of growth and healing, but we took such different routes to get there. But there's a lot of work to be done to show men that it's okay. The last stats I saw for suicide rates, and the percentage of people who die from suicide are men, is like 65 or 70%. Like, it's a huge number. And that's because we've been conditioned to believe we have to be strong, and somehow strength means bottling up our emotions, which is the worst thing we could do. And so we need the support of everyone in society, because a lot of men, when they do open up, they're not always met with a safe place, because, a woman that hasn't done her own healing doesn't know what to do with those emotions. She doesn't know what to do with a man that's being vulnerable. It's scary, because she's been conditioned too to believe what a strong man looks like. We need all of society to stop conditioning our children that that's what strength looks like. Strength looks like vulnerability. And I can tell you from my own experience, it takes much more courage to be vulnerable than it does to bottle my emotions up. It's a whole society problem.
Absolutely. I love that. And you mentioned leaders, leaders who have gone through a mental illness, or they have some issues to open up. And I totally agree with you, especially in organizations. If you don't feel represented in whatever condition you have, it's much tougher. It's much more difficult to open up and say, well, this is what I'm going through. And until we start talking about it, we will never address the issue, right? Because we will never recognize the symptoms. We'll never see in people around us. You mentioned a couple of times, you were in that particular situation, you had that particular reaction, and that should have been a red flag, but nobody realized that, starting with you. And I know for a fact that for me, it was exactly the same. I was in burnout probably for 2 or 3 years before I was sent home, and nobody realized. And my body was telling me that something wasn't right, but I didn't know. I didn't have the understanding. Nobody around me did understand that something wasn't right, because I was as efficient and productive as I used to before.
Yeah. That's all your company or organization cares about, which is brutal.
It's brutal and short-sighted, as you mentioned before, because at the end of the day, if I'm happier and healthier, obviously I can produce more, I can be more efficient. I bring that level of energy. It's not just efficiency. I bring that level of happiness in the workplace, and I can impact others with my happiness, right? I think this is a major issue, and I love what you mentioned. Is not a personal problem, because my experience, and I don't know you, but from what you mentioned, it feels like you went through the same situation. It feels like your mental illnesses or your issues were yours. And I always say perhaps the language that we use is not appropriate. When we say I burn out, it's me who has gone through a burnout. But I didn't do that on my own. It was an environment. And I think it's important to recognize that, and that everybody steps up and takes responsibility. What are your thoughts about it? How can we really push the conversation for everybody to understand that this is not just an individual problem, or problem for the individual that burns out or whatever, but it's more general. It's for the whole organization, it's for the whole society, for the whole community.
Yeah, and I think we do that by, sharing our stories, letting people know, showing them what it looks like. While you were talking, though, I had a thought, because you and I have experienced big T trauma in our childhoods, but no one had a perfect upbringing. And since I started coaching, it seems like everybody has some kind of sense of unworthiness that they got from their childhood. whether they really realize it or not. And many people think they've had good childhoods, but they come carrying this baggage of unworthiness that a lot of times they don't have, or they don't know they have. And they, get into relationships that don't serve them and hang on to them. And then when that ends, they're back in another one as fast as they can because they need that validation from an external source. When it comes to mental health in the workplace, in society in general, we've stigmatized it so badly that people are scared to even ask. They're scared of what the answer might be. I tell people you shouldn't be scared because you literally don't need to know anything. You don't have to have any wise words to tell anybody. You just have to be able to hold space. That's it. They need to feel that you're authentic and you're genuine and caring, but you don't have to say anything, because if they feel safe talking to you, that's half the battle. If they're on the verge, if they're in a bad spot, they will talk to you. Going through this gave me so much more empathy towards everyone. I'm a white guy. I bring my white privilege, even though I didn't think I did. I was stuck in victimhood for years, my trauma and stuff. But life was still easier for me than many, many people. I experienced stigma maybe 2, 3, 4 years of my life with my mental health. There are people that experience stigma their whole lives, and they're several steps behind because every time they leave their house, they're stigmatized in some form or fashion. Sometime after I'd been in therapy, I was working a night shift in a rural municipality. There's nobody around. And I stop a vehicle for speeding. It's a middle-aged male, close to my age. As I'm talking to him and he's getting his documents for me, I sensed that he wasn't doing very well. Something was wrong. And so I stopped him and I just said, "Hey, are you okay?" And he burst into tears because he wasn't okay. He was going through a lot of stress. He had some astronomically high bills that he had to pay that he didn't think he could make the payments on. He was a farmer and it was a bad year for farming and he wasn't sure how he was going to get through. And so all I did was hold space for him. And when he's done talking and finished, I helped him with some resources. I said, "Hey, talk to these people. They can help you. You can get through this." No idea if he ever did, but at least he released his emotions and he was able to think clearly after that. And so that's all you have to do. You don't have to have any words of wisdom. You just have to be the person that someone who's struggling will trust. And so basically you should be a nice person all the time, but we're all dealing with our own shit and we're all stressed out all the time that we're not mindful of our own behavior, let alone how it affects other people. And so then when someone else around us struggles, even though we might be the person that can help them, they might not want to come to us because we're dealing with our own baggage, right? And so if you just be the person that someone can trust and come to, it'll make the world a better place, and it'll make the world a drastically better place for that one person that's struggling.
Absolutely, I love that. What would you say is the perception that social media is, spreading about mental health and stigma? And I don't know what your personal experience is, but since I started getting a little bit more involved with social media, which is basically when I started the podcast, I have the impression that many are trying to use it in a good way. Is it also your perception?
Well, social media is a dangerous place. And I read an article here in Canada where some influencer had made a post about something medically related, even though they didn't have medical training. It took off and it was false information. That's the bad side of social media. For me, I'm very mindful of algorithms, and I'm very careful about what I look at, what I watch, what I view, what I like, what I comment on, all that, because I want to surround myself with positivity and growth. So I'm very careful. So I have a very positive view of social media because in my feeds, it's all people trying to make the world a better place. They're all helping each other, community. And so it's a very good place. And there are a ton of resources on social media. And I've learned a lot on social media, but you have to be so careful because anybody can make a meme and send it out there and you don't know if it's true or not. And if it feeds into your confirmation bias, you share it and it spreads. Social media is a good tool. There's a lot of help out there, but you have to be careful. And even in 2018, 2017, when I was struggling, one of the platforms I'm very big on, I could have probably got a lot of help on. I think, especially for men who are scared to ask for help, I think you can get it on social media if you're searching for it, and you'll find it. And you'll find those people that can help you, even if it's just by their content. And it'll give you some hope, or maybe gives you some more tools to try to pull yourself out of what you're going through, or to just get you to a place where you have the courage to go see a therapist. I know that's a long-winded answer, but I think social media can be used for the right reasons, and there's a lot of resources on there.
Thank you for reminding us that there are algorithms behind every single platform, and we drive those algorithms based on what we like and what we share and what we comment. And sometimes, even if we disagree, by commenting and saying, I don't agree with this, and this is completely rubbish, we still tell the algorithm that is worth spreading and sending that message around. So I think it's very important, and not many people really fully appreciate that aspect of the social media, unfortunately. And when there are topics or posts or videos that can go viral with very bad messages, I think it's very, very dangerous. Mm-hmm. And with that, you mentioned the emotional baggage that we have. What is your way to release that emotional baggage so that you can function again? And in line with the Forgive and Thrive, what do you think about forgiveness? Or I always prefer to talk about self-forgiveness as a possible tool in our toolbox to leave whatever emotion, whether it's anger, guilt, resentment, rage, whatever, behind, and find the courage to perhaps use our voice to share our stories and advocate for the end of stigma, whether it's mental health or any other form of stigma.
So I do something that took me about 5 years to do after my psychologist started telling me to do it. And I journal because I've always been self-aware, and I ask myself a lot of questions, and I ask why I do things. And my psychologist had told me that I was self-aware, so I left it at that. I thought that was good enough. And then several months ago, I had a relationship end, which was very surprising and shocking to me. And I was very heartbroken. And it was the first relationship that I've ever had with another adult other than two of my deceased grandparents, in where I felt completely safe and I was shown unconditional love. And so I was really heartbroken because it was this amazing relationship. But I decided immediately that I was going to start journaling. And the benefits from journaling were amazing. And to me, my definition of healing is journaling and crying. What I do is if something's bothering me and I can't automatically or figure it out like right away, I journal about it. So during a recent breakup, it was easy because there's a lot of pain. There's a lot of pain to tap into. But after a while, you release all that pent up emotion. And so then it's harder to get into, to discover the problem. So I know something's bothering me. I'm not really sure what it is. So I journal. So there's an issue that's bothering you, and there's maybe 3 or 4 different things about it that could be bothering you. So I journal into each one. And as you're writing, you will, if you're paying attention to your body, you can tell when you're getting closer to the root. And so I journal into that until I get emotions. And that's how I release my baggage. And the craziest thing to me, I guess, is that none of it comes from my adult life. All of our baggage comes from our childhood. And it might not be that big T trauma. It might be little things. So self-forgiveness. So forgiveness is a very huge part of my story. And I have some really good examples on how forgiveness for others has improved my life. Self-forgiveness only came in the last several months, and I didn't realize that. So cognitively, I thought I was forgiving myself, and I would forgive myself for things that I did. I used to have a very negative inner voice, and I learned several years ago to catch that, reframe things, not beat myself up. And, a couple of years after working with my psychologist, I dropped a bottle of hot sauce on my floor. It broke, it shattered, it went everywhere. I started laughing and I said, well, I had to clean the floor anyway. I had got to that level of self-forgiveness, but I hadn't dealt with the inner child level of self-forgiveness. And so after this breakup several months ago, during meditation, I would always ask, God or the universe to show me what I needed to heal. Because once I got started and started dealing with all this inner child stuff, I really got carried away. I enjoyed it so much, even though every time I would tap into some inner child pain, that might mean 15 or 20 minutes sitting on the floor just crying my eyes out. But that's releasing decades of pent up emotion. And every time you release emotion, whether you cry for 30 seconds or 20 minutes, you're releasing old emotion that didn't serve you, and now you feel lighter and happier. I remember several months ago during morning meditation, I had asked the universe to show me what I needed to heal. And it comes down to this point of be careful what you ask for. Even the Bible says, ask and you shall receive. So whatever your belief is, if you ask a greater power for something, you're going to get it. So that weekend, I ran into my ex-girlfriend. And at that time, it was only maybe a month after our breakup. A whole bunch of other stuff happened. And I was in emotional turmoil. And I couldn't figure it out. So I was journaling a lot. I did a lot of crying. It was it was crying at times when it didn't make any sense for me to cry. And so that's how I knew it was my inner child. Because if it doesn't make sense to the adult you, it means that it's the inner child doing it. And so I reached out to a couple friends. I talked it out, and I figured out about, I think there was 3 different things in my inner child that I had figured out that this incident had brought up. But I felt there was something more. And I wasn't sure how to tap into it. And so I went to see a friend of mine. He's a shaman type guy. He's talking, he's listening to me, and he's like, it's time you started thinking about forgiveness. But there's nothing to forget. This relationship ending is better for me. I can see how this is a good thing for me. She was just acting at her level of awareness. There's nothing to forgive. I've forgiven her. And he's like, no, you need to think about self-forgiveness. And I'm like, whoa. I felt really bad because when I had encountered her, I sensed that she was sad and I felt guilty about it. I believe that we come into each other's lives to help each other and help each other grow and teach each other lessons, which for almost 2 years we had done. I learned so much from her. She taught me so many lessons, and she had told me the same thing. But I felt sad. I felt that I could have done more to help her. When my friend told me that I needed to think about self-forgiveness, it connected those dots, because I wasn't at a subconscious level, I wasn't forgiving myself for not doing more, which also kind of ties into a sense of unworthiness, right? Always having to do more. And I have this spiritual belief that I am here as a cycle breaker. I'm here to stop generational trauma, but part of that involves healing our ancestors. And so anyway, I'm with my friend. He's telling me that I need to start thinking about self-forgiveness. I realize I make the connection and I get emotional. I start meditating and I just focus on that emotion. And before you know it, I'm bawling, just like never before. I'm crying my eyes out. And I unlock this memory from when I was probably 2 or 3 years old. And I'm standing beside my mom. And she's holding a book that I've written in or scribbled in. I'm showing it to her because I was proud of my work. And she's screaming at me that I'm a bad boy. And I realized in that moment that I could never forgive myself, or I had never been able to forgive myself, because I'd learned at this young age that I was a bad person and I always had to do more. And so I was sitting there and I'm just bawling my eyes out, releasing. And suddenly I felt this calm presence in the room. And a group of my ancestors showed up. My grandpa and my grandmother showed up and they knelt beside me and they put their hands on my shoulder and they watched me and they told me, we never learned how to do this. And it was such an amazing experience. It was then that I realized how I needed to forgive myself. But it's memories that formed us and formed our ideas about ourselves that we don't even remember. And that was imprinted in my life, my whole life. And it was reinforced many times during my childhood. And then I surrounded myself with people that reinforced it. My own inner voice reinforced it. And so, yeah, I was 43 years old before I realized at what level I needed to forgive myself. And it was very freeing, very freeing.
Beautiful story. And do you have any final message that you want to leave us on how we can advocate for mental health, how we can fight the stigma?
It starts by talking about it. Start slowly if you have to. Talk to one really good friend about it. And then you find out how similar they are to you. And then maybe you talk to somebody else about it. You realize how similar they are to you. Because when we shed light on it, the shame and the stigma dies. That's how it have to be. And just understand that we're all operating with our own baggage. And whether it's obvious or not, really, we're all the same. We all struggle. And if we talk about it, shines the light on it, makes it easier for everyone. Recognize that you're dealing with your own stuff, whether you realize it or not. Try to heal yourself. Be that person that someone can come to. Be that person that asks someone if they're okay.
That is so beautiful. Laverne, coming back to you, is there anything particular that you want to share with us about what you do, and if you have anything planned for the rest of the year?
No big events or anything like that. I do have a speaking event at a mental health awareness event. I'm very passionate about speaking about it. I hope that shows through on this. I am a mental health mentor and personal growth mentor. I am a mentor. I've been through a lot of experiences and I can help you get through yours and build that self-awareness, because I think everybody should be happy at a level that only inner child healing can bring. And so I did that. I started that after that breakup I went through. I started doing all the right things that I knew for years that I should be doing. The big thing was I started journaling and learning about myself. And in that process, I taught myself that I was worthy of love at that subconscious level and that I could provide that love for myself. Once I realized that, I realized I had to share that with other people. And so I developed a program, which I was just going to sell online because I still had resistance about putting myself out there and being a coach. And then I realized that no, I have to be able to coach that, because I want people to get the most out of what I learned, and I want them to be as happy as they can be. That's what I'm here to do. And I love doing it and I love talking about it.
Beautiful. So if our listeners would like to know more about you, get in touch with you, where can they find you?
On Facebook at Laverne Friesen. I do most of my social media content on TikTok at True Emotion Coach. And my website is trueemotion.ca. So it's pretty easy. Either way, I answer messages all the time. So
Fantastic. And as always, we will put everything in the show notes of today's episode. Laverne, very final question. If there was one take-home message that you would love everybody to remember from this conversation, what that would be?
Well, there's two, because there's two different types of people. So if you're struggling right now, reach out. No matter how scary it is, reach out. And if you don't get help the first time, reach out again. This doesn't need to be prolonged for a couple years like mine was. Just reach out. There is help. Someone out there understands. There are many people out there that understands what you're going through, so reach out. If you're not struggling and someone seems a little different, ask them if they're okay. Be genuine. Don't be scared of the answer. Remember, all you have to do is hold space. So just reach out and ask them.
What a beautiful message to conclude this episode. Well, I hope that my conversation with Laverne has shed some light on the deep and often hidden impacts that stigma can have on individuals and society as a whole. Remember, as we just learned, seeking help is a sign of strength and not weakness. By supporting each other and speaking openly about mental health challenges, we can break down the barriers that stigma creates and help create a more compassionate and understanding world. And if you are in a dark space right now, I want to leave you with a beautiful reminder from the Dalai Lama, who said, "You are not alone, and you are not your illness." Laverne, thank you so much for accepting our invitation, for sharing so openly about your life story. I think it's a remarkable story and remarkable mission, the one that you have to stop stigma. And I hope to continue this conversation with you in the months and years to come, because I think the world needs to hear those stories and create that muscle of compassion for each other's suffering. So thank you so much.
Thank you for having me. Just doing this podcast is helping. So thank you.
Oh, thank you. Well, we would love to know what you think about this topic. What's your story? Have you been experiencing some stigma perhaps about your mental health condition or for any other reason? Let us know. But if sharing feels challenging, I'm sure you will find this episode very inspiring. And if you have never experienced stigma, as Laverne reminded us, I hope that after listening to our conversation, you will practice more compassion and support to anyone who might be struggling. Whatever or wherever you are and whatever your needs are, if you think you could do with some extra help, do check Laverne's website, his work, and follow him on social media. You will find all the links in the description of today's episode. Hopefully not, but if you have been affected in any way by the topic we discussed today, as always, I invite you to seek professional help. Join me next time when we will continue exploring inspiring and challenging situations. Because remember, we are together in this journey. Thanks for watching. If you enjoy this content, subscribe to our channel. And don't forget to hit the notification bell and like this video. See you in the next one.